Welcome to Series 4 of the Public Interest Technology Colloquium. We are delighted to be hosting this series and have an engaging program lined up for you today. My name is Kathleen M, and I'm the Director of the Society Policy Engineering Collective in the School for the Future of Innovation at Arizona State University. And I'm joined today by my wonderful co-host, Dr. Robert Abbas, who's a Senior Lecturer in the School of Business at the University of Wollongong, Australia, and also the Socio-Technical Systems Technical Committee Chair at the IEEE. Robert and I would like to acknowledge the work and support of Melissa Wyatt and the events team at the College of Global Futures at ASU. Before we commence our session, I would like to take a moment to reflect on the series to date and what a wonderful series it has been so far. We're just past that halfway point. We've journeyed from Series 1, which focused on values, responsible innovation, and COVID-specific technological responses, to Series 2, which centered on storytelling, imagination, and participatory design methodologies, to Series 3, which emphasized the global perspective with respect to the social, regulatory, and ethical considerations relevant to the design, development, and delivery of technology in the public interest. Now, in this series, Series 4, we illuminate a path toward transdisciplinarity, hosting international speakers who will share their perspectives on experts and expertise, innovation ecosystems, multi-stakeholder approaches, and opportunities and challenges relating to addressing complex societal challenges. In today's session, we are super delighted to be hosting Professor Kathleen Vogel. Kathleen Vogel is a professor at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University. She's served in the US Department of State as a Jefferson Science Fellow in the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, and as a William C. Foster Fellow in the Office of Proliferation, Threat Reduction in the Bureau of Non-Proliferation. Kathleen has also spent time as a visiting scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, Cooperative Monitoring Center, Sandia National Laboratories, and the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, Monterey Institute of International Studies. Now, it gets better because last year we had to invent an award for Professor Vogel because we believed that she had outstripped the existing awards in the faculty. But this just demonstrates, based on the fellowships, the stature of this wonderful researcher. Kathleen holds a PhD in biophysical chemistry from Princeton University, and Kathleen's overall research interests relate to the study of knowledge production on security and intelligence problems. Kathleen's presentation is titled Big Data, AI, and the Future of the US Intelligence Workforce. And first, Kathleen will be presenting a paper from the Intelligence and National Security Journal, published last year, where she and her co-authors investigated the impact of AI on intelligence analysis, tackling issues of collaboration, algorithmic transparency, accountability, and management. And after her presentation, we will welcome 4 guest Q&A panelists to be discussants and share their ideas and reflections on Kathleen's presentation. So with that, we welcome Kathleen to the PIC Colloquium.
Thank you so much, Katina, for that lovely introduction. And I'm so excited to be here at the PIC Colloquium, and also to be able to hopefully have a really interesting set of conversations with the panelists that will be joining me here today as well. I also, before I start, want to thank my colleagues, Gwendolynne Reid, Chris Kampe, and Paul Jones. These were my co-authors on the paper that I'm going to talk about today. So I thought I'd start out first by giving you a little bit of background on essentially what I'm going to talk to you about today and sort of how I got interested in this issue. And I will say I've long been interested in how to think about intelligence analysis, how to improve intelligence analysis in light of issues around emerging technologies. And in particular, my past and present work has really tried to understand various institutional and contextual factors that shape intelligence work, and how we need to understand how these factors shape knowledge production and intelligence, particularly in cases of intelligence failure. And I have a 2013 book that I published that you see the book cover there, where I sort of go into this more, particularly related to issues around the intelligence failures around the ROC weapons of mass destruction assessments that occurred in the United States. And through my work, I've interviewed a variety of different intelligence practitioners from different intelligence agencies for over the past 10 years. And most of my past work has been looking at how these analysts, how these practitioners assess weapons threats, for example. And particularly there, I've been looking at how the intelligence community views these technologies. So it's more of the technologies as being kind of the object of intelligence analysis. Whereas this current work, which is looking at big data and AI technologies, here I'm kind of looking at it from a different angle, looking at how these technologies are serving as what is seen as a conduit or enabler for intelligence analysis, and sort of how these technologies essentially impact the user, which is the actual analyst who's trying to do a variety of different kinds of threat assessments. I would say that to date, most of the writing about big data and AI technologies for intelligence has tended to focus on sort of the collection side of intelligence, and a lot focused on how these technologies are going to enable more surveillance on the outside world, and how these technologies might be used to aid different kinds of combat operations. But my particular interest is really looking more at the internal, the analytic side of intelligence, which I do think is an understudied aspect of knowledge work by both data scientists and intelligence scholars. And I'm very interested in trying to understand how these technologies, as they're emerging, are being developed for use within the US intelligence community in particular, although it'd be interesting to chat with some of the panelists about how some of my work might relate to some other countries in this regard. And I've been particularly interested in trying to understand the perspectives that working intelligence practitioners might have about these technologies and how they might be used in their workplace. I would argue that there typically are very few studies that try to open up the black box of intelligence. And I feel that, again, this is an understudied area that would really benefit for inquiry. And again, how users in these sort of secret communities think about technologies, how they use technologies, et cetera. So far, all of my work in this space related to looking at the intelligence community has been unclassified, although we can talk in the Q&A about how there are sort of pros and cons about doing classified work in this space. I'd be happy to sort of talk about that if you're interested. Today, my talk is going to sort of cover this paper that I published, as Katina mentioned, in 2021, that looks at interview data that I gathered from intelligence practitioners about how particular kinds of big data and AI technologies were being designed and developed and deployed for the future intelligence workspace. And so my focus here in doing these interviews is really to look at sort of a focus on sort of human-centered design and development of these prototypes, and sort of value-centered design, and really trying to understand whether different organizational and cultural factors and values that are already present in intelligence work that are going to shape sort of how these technologies might be adopted now and into the future. And so I'm very much interested in kind of really thinking about the social implications of these technologies in this very unique workspace of intelligence, and then articulating sort of why we should care about the user, about the intelligence analyst, and their reactions to these technologies. This paper that I'm talking about today is part of the larger emergent book project that I have in development that's really looking at different case studies for how big data and AI technologies are going to be used in the future of intelligence analysis, and various workforce implications that these might have. To start things out, I'd mentioned to you this 2019 study that was published by the Office of the Director of Intelligence in the United States. In 2019, it released its first AI strategy for the US intelligence community, and I list here just some of the different kind of quotes from the report that sort of talk about how the intelligence community is starting to think about these technologies for their workforce. And generally, it's a really interesting read. It's a short read, but it's a very interesting read because this document really starts signaling the importance of these technologies and how they're going to play in future intelligence work. And you'll sort of start to see, even with this document, how they're already starting to think on the analyst side, how there are various technologies that they're thinking to develop that really aim to improve analyst efficiency, productivity, and accuracy in doing a variety of different kinds of assessment work within intelligence. And so before this 2019 strategy was issued, I was already doing some unclassified contract work for an NSA-funded laboratory where they were developing a particular kind of prototype, again, thinking about how big data and AI technologies might be used into the future. And this particular prototype gathered computational data about an analyst's digital workflow, and it was under development at that time to also see how they can incorporate different kinds of AI techniques to automate various tasks and analyses of an analyst's daily, weekly, or monthly work practices. They were also interested in exploring how this particular prototype, again, could be developed to anticipate and share data, to share workflows and work practices with other analysts, in many ways to facilitate collaboration among different kinds of analysts. And this prototype was somewhat analogous to some other kinds of big data AI productivity tools that are already being used in the private sector, but with, again, these added features of trying to anticipate kind of analyst workflows, anticipate data streams, try and facilitate collaboration as well. And I was interested in doing an ethnographic study around this prototype at this lab with this goal of really trying to sort of understand how working intelligence practitioners were thinking about these technologies for analysis, also exploring what concerns they might have about these technologies that might be entering into their workplace. And then reflecting from that to say, okay, how do we take these perspectives into account now as we're really still in the early stages and the development stages of trying to think about design of these technologies and how we might think again, how they might be developed. Before this work, it involved gathering 12 semi-structured interviews that were about up to 2.5 hours each with intelligence practitioners at this particular lab where I was working. And you can see how the different backgrounds of these analysts here in the next bullet points. I would say, although a lot of them had worked in different kinds of roles in the intelligence community, they all had done different kinds of analytic work as part of their career path. And they were all also very experienced analysts, ranging anywhere from 10 to 40 years of work in the intelligence community, about 20 years or so, average age range. They also represented not only working level, but there were some managers, folks who had managerial experience in the intelligence community also as part of this group. I will say, because this is a small sample size, I have to say these interviews, these perspectives are not representative across the IC. But I do think that they raise issues that are consistent with past published literature on the intelligence community in the US. And we can sort of talk about, different facets of this in the Q&A as well. And part of the work in terms of doing these interviews was trying to sort of identify what were some kind of recurrent themes that emerged from these interviews as these individuals were exposed to this prototype that I just mentioned, and kind of as we talk through what this prototype might do, different reflections on how that might affect their current or their future work in the intelligence community. And I have to say also, all the names stated here are pseudonyms. Just one thing just to talk about in terms of, just to start out with, in terms of the perceived utility kind of these kind of technologies is embodied in this particular prototype that I asked these practitioners to think with. The general response of using this technologies to make intelligence analysts' lives easier was really uniformly positive in their views in the interviews. They saw a lot of benefits to analysts by incorporating potentially some of these technologies into their work. It would allow them to really stay more on top of things related to some of their taskings. And particularly, different issues came up about just sort of the burdens that analysts have in their daily work lives, how they're often under constant pressure, very short timelines, often have to multitask, have to switch between the classified and unclassified systems as part of their daily work. And how a tool that would basically make their lives easier in this regard was seen as a very positive thing. Folks who had managerial experience also sort of talked about how these kinds of technologies, again, could create more productive and efficient analysts. It might give managers, if they were able to get outputs of some of these tools to see maybe where some problems or bottlenecks might rise, it might help them to identify where interventions might be needed in a way to have better managerial decision-making as part of an intelligence analysis process. So overall, there was definitely a recognition that these technologies could definitely be very beneficial to intelligence analysts. I'll say what was interesting in these interviews were also some concerns that these intelligence practitioners raised as they sort of thought through about this particular prototype and the kinds of future that it was imagining for intelligence analyst workflows. And some of the concerns that were expressed essentially fall between three particular categories. Collaboration challenges that might arise from this kind of technology, issues around algorithmic transparency and accountability, and then third, issues around algorithmic management. And I would say that the concerns expressed in these interviews are also consistent with other published literature on the daily work lives of intelligence analysts, and even with other kinds of technologies, not necessarily kind of big data or AI technologies, but other technologies that have entered into intelligence work into the past. And I think what this reveals is that there are particular organizational and analytic cultures within intelligence that shape technology adoption. And as I will sort of talk about later, solutions to these kind of concerns or problems are going to require socio-technical interventions. It's not just going to be a technological fix alone. And again, as I mentioned earlier, you know, these descriptions that I'm talking about here are not true of each and every intelligence worker, unit, agency, and many exceptions to the following can be found, but I think they do raise interesting points for discussion about these technologies and how they enter the workplace, and in this case, the intelligence workplace. So the first issue that I thought I'd talk about is this issue of collaboration challenges, and I will refer this also to this as this interesting issue of knowledge is power, and I'll talk more about that here in the next slide. And essentially the interviews tended to reveal this tension about they see the role of these technologies, how they might enable collaboration in different ways, but also they were very concerned about the need to protect and control information and how that might be affected by these new kinds of collaborative tools. And I will say, you know, this tension has existed, you know, over the past decades, and this sort of how to think about and how to manage collaboration has often been a source of tension within the intelligence community. I would say for quite a while now, US intelligence leaders have really sort of called for the need for more collaboration, for more integrated operations within and across all intelligence agencies. And there have been different examples pointed to the September 11th attacks, as well as to problems with the Iraq war assessments that showed problems with collaboration, problems with information sharing, problems with a lack of integration across units that should have been collaborating. And so some have sort of looked at this and said, well, maybe we can develop new computational tools and technologies to better enable collaboration and information sharing. And so, as I mentioned, you know, previously, although a lot of our interviewees really, you know, wanted and thought collaboration was very important, and saw how these kinds of new technologies could aid with that, they also sort of talked about different kinds of cultural and institutional forces within intelligence that work against collaboration and openness, even again within the intelligence community, within this closed secret community itself. So analysts that we interviewed kind of described ineffective collaboration with intelligence, not solely in terms of different classification barriers that exist, and those do exist, and we can talk about that as something that can impede collaboration. But they also sort of talked about collaboration challenges that relate to conflicts with unstated norms, as well as personal goals, not only of, you know, fellow intelligence analysts, but also managers, and how these can arise and sort of hinder collaboration by analysts. And so I thought I'd show you just a few quotes from some of the interviewees next that sort of kind of talk about where these kinds of conflicts and norms can arise, and they usually relate to sort of advancement and recognition issues within the intelligence community. So David, one interview, he said, I think people can tend to get territorial because they want to be able to cite the things that they did in their performance plan. So here you see kind of a focus on the performance plan, and that was something that came up multiple times, is concerns about how these technologies are going to affect the performance plans. Christine next sort of talks about this, and she says they can sort of be hindered by competition. That actually does happen a fair amount in our workplace environment. People don't want to have to step in on their turf, so to speak. And then Carl next sort of says, and he sort of makes this very interesting comment, knowledge is power. I mean, your ability to construct a good, compelling narrative that gets you in front of the present is very promotable. And so maybe you don't want your peers to see how it is that you're building that story. So we can talk more about this kind of in the Q&A, but an intelligence analyst's performance evaluation is essentially their publication record as an individual, at least in the US intelligence community. And it's much more of what you might think of a traditional academic community of a publisher parish environment, where an individual and what they're able to sort of write and produce on their own is what gets them promoted and rewarded. So you can see that a more collaborative process challenges that sort of traditional environment. And this does not suggest that all analysts fail to share information or collaborate. But I think what these quotes, and there's other published work that talk about this, is that there's this very strong a parallel kind of performance culture that tends to value and reward individual work and individual effort in analytic work and not collaboration. And this problem of collaboration intelligence has been documented by intelligence scholars for decades. And it suggests that this is a significantly ingrained issue in the intelligence community work culture. Again, although, different exceptions, I'm sure, exist. And typically it requires specific managerial interventions to essentially promote collaboration. So while most analysts we interviewed were drawn to these new computational tools for what they could do to improve collaboration and their potential for improved knowledge sharing, they also sort of talk about how this was in conflict with the practical day-to-day recognition that knowledge is power in intelligence work, and that individual analysts and their managers have incentives in some cases to not collaborate or share information as much as they could. And this is something that these new collaborative computational technologies are going to have to overcome if they're going to be widely and effectively adopted to promote collaboration. And so essentially what our interviews kind of showed through this study is that technologies alone are not going to solve the collaboration and information sharing problem in intelligence. And so the intelligence community really needs to start thinking about, if they want these technologies to improve collaboration, how are they also going to institute new social arrangements for analysis with new policies, procedures, and incentive structures that work in concert with these technologies to promote collaboration if they really want to see change in this space. Sorry if you can't see the top of that slide. The next sort of issue that I wanted to talk about is the issue of algorithmic transparency and accountability. And this is another issue that came up a lot across our different interviews, and it was the desire by intelligence analysts to better understand how algorithms in these kind of AI systems make decisions and who would be held accountable in cases of error. So for example, some of these technologies under development would operate similarly to social media platforms for curating and sharing information and knowledge within the intelligence community. And there were concerns expressed that if sort of things were posted and they were shared too early without vetting, that some of our interviewees suggested that there might be sort of mistaken kind of assumptions or takeaways about these posts and about the sources data analysis that's sort of behind some of those posts. And so in the next slide, I thought I'd show you an interviewee by the name of Robert, who sort of talked about this scenario. Again, by these kinds of social media-like platforms. Robert says, they might say the person who wrote this seems like they know more than I do, so I'm going to go run with that. The other possible problem, and this may be more born out of paranoia than anything else, if I had made some notes on the system and if someone took those and said, oh, well, this is what Robert thinks of the system and presents them as my official line of thinking is, because I've had that happen before. And so the underlying issue that's voiced here is that a partial or flawed idea that an analyst was still working through, but sort of shared through these new computational platforms, could be misapprehended by another, maybe more inexperienced, a junior analyst, that could then lead to sort of errors being incorporated into intelligence assessments down the road. One of the practitioners that we talked to sort of noted that although they felt information sharing should really occur at the earliest point of relevance or interest, they felt there was benefit to sharing information, that there still currently are very limited mechanisms for checking hypotheses and vetting the associated risk trails of various information sources. And so already there are issues that can result in bad information being unwittingly inserted into a good analytic flow, and they're concerned that this problem could just magnify with these new kind of AI technologies. And so the lack of kind of context or the level of certainty about maybe some of these postings and the readiness of the data that was being shared was repeated by many analysts that we interviewed as a source of concern. Really sort of thinking about when information is shared or made available or posted, that it's not necessarily self-evident that it's accurate, or what the context is around it, and that there's a need to really understand, kind of the context of an analyst's work to really make sure that the sense making is accurate in intelligence analysis. And so to this end, Robert, for example, when he was talking about the example, spoke about, he felt you need to have different kind of functions maybe developed as part of these technologies, maybe a releasability or a draft feature that might be instituted on these technologies to help better communicate the readiness or maybe draftiness of the material that was being shared, and maybe other kinds of controls where you could determine who could see what and when things were posted. So again, kind of thinking about what could be other functions that could be incorporated into these technologies to potentially deal with this concern of information that's too drafty or too early that's being shared. And so these comments sort of highlight concerns intelligence analysts have about trusting and verifying data sharing, by these new computing platforms, as well as, they started in talking about this, really kind of trying to think through what would be the appropriate process for vetting kind of this information sharing. And essentially what they're talking about is platform governance. Like, what would platform governance look like in the intelligence community with these classified social media-like systems? Concerns about how analytic errors could arise from trusting the use of these technologies too much without really understanding the assumption and the algorithms kind of behind them. And so kind of another comment along these lines by one of our interviewees, Jennifer, sort of also talked about this concern. And here Jennifer says, it's very important to have transparency and control over the data, because for one thing, you don't want any type of tool or technology to kind of capture or alter data or do something that you're not aware of, because it changes the outcome maybe that you expect. You just have to have some kind of interaction throughout the process. I'm supposed to be the subject matter expert, and I'm using a capability or technology to help me step through this process of understanding and coming to this resolution or this outcome. I need to know what was involved, because you're going to get asked, how did you come to that conclusion, or what happened? So you won't be able to speak to the data that was used. So Jennifer's remarks here show us some analyst hesitation over the black boxing of how these algorithms work to produce certain kinds of analytic results, over being held accountable for their conclusions. And analysts want to ensure that errors and biases are not introduced into the data or into the data outputs from how these algorithms are constructed, to the kinds of training data that are being used, and the various constraints that can be introduced through kind of this whole process of how these technologies are being used if we're starting to think about automated intelligence analysis. So in essence, Jennifer and other analysts we spoke to want some kind of algorithmic transparency and accountability for these new kinds of computational systems, so they can trust their outputs and know that what goes into them and what comes out is accurate and explainable. And so this raises, a series of interesting questions, I think, that we still need answers to. For these future AI-enabled analytic systems, who would be responsible for checking the reliability of their outputs? How exactly would errors be uncovered? Would that require opening up the data sets, the code, the coding platforms? Who would do this work to ensure trustworthy and reproducible results? What happens if there's intelligence failure? How do you kind of think through that kind of process and reconstructing where the error occurred? These are all kinds of questions that I think are critically important for trusting some of these systems. And I would say these are definitely the ones that need more attention as these systems are getting developed within the intelligence community. As Gina Neff and others have argued, what these new computational systems reveal is that the data that they generate shouldn't be considered sort of a starting point or a go-to point, or they should be considered a starting point and not an end point, and that we really need a lot more discussion, deliberations sort of around, how to make sense of their outputs. And again, collectively, what we heard kind of through our interviews was just concerns about analytic mistakes that might occur through the use of these technologies and how they might introduce certain errors and biases that the analysts might not be aware of, but then might be shaping the outputs that result. And so all of our interviewees really wanted greater transparency in and accountability for how these systems are set up and used in practice so they can trust their outputs. So just again, something just interesting that kind of came through some of these different interviews. The next issue that came up, that was a theme across some of the different issues, was the issue of algorithmic management. And here, this is where it kind of shifted from the use of AI as a tool for intelligence analysis versus the use of AI as an intelligence management tool. And how some of these different tools as are being adopted and incorporated into the intelligence community workplace are really trying to understand the analyst and their work themselves and sort of thinking through what this means for how they might be used to manage workforces, how they might relate to more surveillance on analysts themselves, et cetera. And so similar to other kinds of workplace settings, the intelligence analysts we interviewed worried about how their data, the data that's coming out from these kind of systems that are kind of surveilling their daily workflows might lead to mistaken managerial conclusions and decisions, particularly around sort of their work patterns and their productivity patterns. And what I found really interesting, kind of as this came up, is that intelligence workers already have no expectations of privacy. This is from day one, from the moment you sign on the dotted line to take an intelligence job, that you are going to have to be subjected to a variety of very intrusive investigations, medical tests, psychological tests, background checks, in some cases polygraphs. But what's interesting is when it actually gets to their day-to-day work, they still want some kind of privacy or freedom or boundaries set around workplace monitoring. So I just found that just really interesting. I was not expecting that to kind of come out from some of these interviews. This is what one of my interviewees, Robert, says. He says, one of the things that I've often seen is metadata lies. And if a manager who's probably already overwhelmed with lots of things has data in order that they think can be used to improve efficiency and productivity, they're going to look at that data, they're going to come to some conclusions. They're probably not going to have time to ask all the employees, well, what is it that you were doing when you did this? They then begin to implement some policies that may not have the desired effect or have some negative second or third order effects. In talking about this, Robert and some others that we interviewed sort of talk about that not all intelligence managers have experience as analysts or in the analytic process. They might not also have sort of data science backgrounds to sort of understand kind of the meaning behind some of these analytic outputs. And so the analysts that we interviewed wanted managers to really be able to understand kind of the specific local problems and context of their daily work lives and how that's generating this metadata to more accurately interpret what this data means. They don't really want the output, the metadata, to be taken as is, but again, more of this kind of a starting point for conversation so that managers could have a more holistic or more nuanced understanding of how an analyst is working in their productivity. This raises kind of this concern about, not only having access maybe to this data that's being collected, but also to influence what types of information are counted as productivity and how they're weighted to assess analyst work. These comments about concerns about these worker productivity kind of technologies are comparable to other data science studies that show that people are much more comfortable with and trust in a fair outcome when there's a human involved in the performance evaluation process, rather than leaving these decisions solely to an algorithm. And so, our interviews sort of talked about how, if these kinds of technologies are going to be deployed on analysts, they really want their managers to be trained in these systems to really understand the biases and the omissions, that can occur with these systems. They want to be able to provide additional kind of qualitative data that can explain their productivity, et cetera, and what could be valued in their performance evaluations beyond just what's only quantifiable within these kinds of big data systems. Just kind of moving into kind of the conclusion here, and just would be happy to open up for discussion with the panelists and the broader audience. I think what this study shows is that intelligence analysts do care about these technologies, and they care and they're concerned about who and what counts with these technologies, how the data is going to be used, and to what ends. And what I found in terms of doing this study, Helen Niesenbaum's book, Privacy and Context, was pretty useful in sort of thinking through, kind of thinking about how these kinds of socio-technical systems, the implications for how these systems get introduced. And she talks about how support for these kind of socio-technical systems is present when informational norms are respected, but when these norms are breached, objections and resistances can arise. And you can already see kind of through these interviews that some of these technologies have the potential to violate certain existing norms that are present in intelligence work. And sort of how these kind of norms relate to an analyst's data or workflow practices and products, issues around kind of information sharing, platform governance, kind of this black boxing of algorithmic processes that are of a concern. And then more close to home, kind of how an analyst might be promoted or rewarded. There's a lot of concerns about how these technologies might upend some existing norms in these contexts. And implementing these kinds of technologies is predicated on analysts trusting and adopting them as part of their work. And it's going to require that the intelligence community and the designers behind these technologies really think about what could be different kinds of both technical and social interventions that might address some of these concerns that might be raised as these new technologies are being designed and developed. So there, I'm just going to end. I'm going to say, if you're interested in sort of reading more about this study, it is available in the Journal of Intelligence and National Security. I want to thank the intelligence practitioners who were willing to be interviewed for this project, and other academic colleagues. Also, I appreciate the Alan Turing Institute that gave me some time to kind of think through some of this interview data, and then also the Laboratory for Analytic Sciences, which supported this work. So with that, I will end, and I'll turn it back over to you, Katina.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for that comprehensive presentation. It demonstrates how rich qualitative data can be through interviews. It's not something you often see, but I think transdisciplinarity and our PIC Colloquium invites a lot of qualitative research, and we just were the recipients of outcomes from that work. So very insightful when it comes to understanding the opportunities and challenges within intelligence organizations whose core mission arguably is to protect the public interest and the nation's borders. As I mentioned earlier, today we have with us 4 unique voices who are joining us together with Kathleen on the Q&A panel. And Robert and I thought we'd try something different, and we reached out to acquaintances. We reached out to Theresa Anderson. Welcome, Theresa, from Connecting Stones. Theresa is a social informatician and data scientist. She was actually responsible for Australia's first pioneering data science master's degree at the University of Technology, Sydney, Australia. She's an associate professor. She began her career as an analyst and then a diplomat for the US, and now consults with her business. We also have Austin Wyatt, who is with the RAND Australia Corporation and formerly at the University of New South Wales, ADFA, the Australian Defence Force Academy. We have Mariana Zafeirakopoulos, a PIC Colloquium presenter, most recently on transdisciplinarity with Gabriel Banner from ANU. And she has a rich background, in fact, in strategic intelligence, so we've asked her to come back. And last but not least, an emerging voice, Jack Goldsmith, who has completed a number of degrees and is currently finishing studies at the Australian National University, but also working for a company, CyberCX. So we welcome the panel. So great to have you with us, each and every one of you. And we'll begin with Theresa Anderson.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And I always worry with the name Anderson, I tend to be the first person off the rank. So Kathleen, there's so much I'd love to share about this. I want to say, just picking up on something that Katina mentioned, as an ethnographer myself, I really appreciated the way that in the paper that you provided and the way that you were presenting it today, that you really showed your hand in terms of how that material was worked with and the insights that were gleaned. And one of the observations that I had in terms of the challenges around analysis, coincidentally, goes back to some of the core practices in good qualitative research. So I don't want to jump too much. I've made some notes to try to keep me on track. So I'll come to that connection between data science and qualitative analysis, because I think it is one of those opportunities for further work in this field. And as you said, focusing on the analysis side of knowledge work is very understudied, not necessarily just in this domain, but I think across the board. There is so little that is articulated in the fullness of detail that is really required to get into the black box of the human mind. And so that's really important. And the idea of opening the black box was very exciting for me in reading this, because as Katina mentioned, my early work was in intelligence and diplomacy. And the idea of working with black boxes was very much at the heart of what I did back in analog days. So I was, one of my first jobs as an analyst was to try to help contribute understanding about the black box of the Soviet Union. And that first role I had no longer exists because it's done largely by a machine. And yet aspects of that work have disappeared because what a human knows isn't encoded necessarily in those machines. So I think I really felt that as I was reading those quotes from analysts. I was sensing a lot of resonance as well in terms of current work that I'm doing in relation to making the invisible visible. So I work now actively as a data and AI ethicist, and so often the assumption is made that the data that is now presented to us and handed to us through these algorithmic tools provides the insight, or provides at least that full picture that enables us to make decisions better. And so that more, faster, better challenge is something that I was sensing acutely in the interviews that you were reporting on, that isn't necessarily the case, that there are risks. The challenge, of course, is that in the analyst space, as you flagged, there is the concern, particularly around needing to do it now. So speed is very much there. Increasingly, scale is different. So to a certain extent, a lot of those challenges existed back in the old dinosaur days of analog work, but definitely scale, speed, and time have really multiplied. And so I think that there is that. It really argues for taking a very clear socio-technical stance on this, because you cannot just look at the technology, you're having to understand the people as well. I was struck in your discussion around the collaboration and the challenges around collaboration, of the similarities to other knowledge generating organizations and cultures. The work that I've done a lot in social informatics and information use has come up with some similar challenges. So the collaboration competition tension, that when your performance is measured because you are contributing new knowledge, you're inclined to hold on to the kernels that will demonstrate your value and your worth. And yet collaboration and connection is how you increase and enhance that. And I think that's increasingly the case now with the algorithmic tools that are, in a sense, new partners in knowledge generation here, because they can give you that big picture much faster. You know, going back to my early analog days, there's no way as much as I enjoyed it as a young analyst to be able to be in that space, it was very tedious. So if there is a machine that can do some of that better, sure. But finding the kernels is something that does seem to require that that human input. So the issues around knowledge generation and the role of culture in there, and getting the right humans in the loop, is something that was coming through as well. So there was a point where you were saying that you were finding that analysts that you were talking to from an algorithmic management standpoint were more comfortable if there was a human that was making decisions. I think I would add to that I think it depends on which human, because in some instances, a machine might provide evidence that will support a worker more so than a leader who isn't necessarily managing, or a manager who's necessarily supporting. So I think there is, as we move forward, a real argument to be made for empathic leadership. So, I go back to some of the early statements from Vannevar Bush and when he was talking in 1945, imagining how technologies could be used to help support human thought. And what supporting human thought then does, if technologies are used that way, is it frees up the human to do what humans do best, which I would say is creativity. And now increasingly it's empathic leadership. And certainly in the values-led design space, it's saying, okay, some of what you were describing and some of what is in this space is never going to be encoded, never completely encoded. Because it remains visible. It's more in the pauses in between the data. It's more in the spaces. It's in the absences of data. So making those judgments at sight becomes really challenging. And that comes back to that point about qualitative research and the practices of an ethnographer. I've been sort of toying with this idea of data ethnography, to sort of say that certainly as an analyst, and I found that when I was training data scientists, going back to that early work when I was working in the analog space, essentially trying to be a human computer to look for what was not there. How do you then explain what it is that you have found? How do you evidence what you have not seen? How do you make a decision based on incomplete, imperfect information? Because that's really what is happening. And so I was suddenly remembering, sorry, I'm just looking at my notes and I will stop. Please, Katina, make sure I don't go on too long. But there was, when you were talking about algorithmic management and the challenges around the reading of uncertainty and the handling of that imprecise and incomplete information, I was suddenly reminded of an interview I heard with a leader during the 2019 bushfires here in Australia. One of the heads of the emergency services was commenting that all information will always be incomplete, all time will never be enough, and yet you still have to make a decision. And so a lot of that comes down to, and they were dealing there very often with modeling that was based on data that was drawing on the past. And the past, as that example really showed, and it reminds me very much of some of the huge crises in intelligence of recent times, where even the recent past was not sufficiently encoded in data to be able to model what was about to happen. And that definitely came through in the 2019-2020 bushfires, where it just couldn't keep up with what was on the ground. And so what was required was the human leadership in that space, the expertise of people, firefighters who had worked on the ground. And again, thinking in terms of analysts, the experts who have been in the countries that are being examined or analyzed, the experts in those domains, the experts with those people. So it strikes me just in closing that if we are going to start to understand not just how to move forward better in any of these knowledge generating spaces, but particularly strikes me intelligence, given how critical it is for the decisions around security and defense and the systems within that, not just the individual people working in those spaces, but the policy decisions that are shaped by that. That what we're really looking at is ways to ensure that AI becomes a partner and neither a slave nor a master in this space. And that, again, the human qualities of analysis and the human qualities of judgment and the making of the invisible more visible at the time when it needs to be such becomes critical, so that you get, like a good ethnography, horizontal and vertical slices that recognize that complexity. And I think if we start thinking in that big picture way, then the machines will help us to do the things that will free up that time for the humans to be better humans. So I'll stop there before I get very carried away. But again, thank you very much for inviting me to participate and letting me go first.
Thank you so much, Theresa. Kathleen, any thoughts there in response?
I mean, I definitely agree. It was a lot of head nodding throughout your comments, and you know, this, how we sort of start separating these tools. And I should mention that one of the original ideas behind this prototype that they were thinking with was the idea of how could this prototype save an analyst 4 hours of their workday. So it's the efficiency that was the original kind of motivator for this technology. But as you kind of raise, there are other considerations beyond just efficiency that we need to also be thinking about. I'm not saying that that was the only that was the only driver, but you know, when that is sort of a priority, then sometimes these other considerations can fall out, and I think we do need to be thinking about kind of these other social dimensions more. So just, that's a brief response, but so much more that I could say, but I know there's other panelists, and I'm eager to hear what they have to say too.
It was great, and often those exceptions tell us more about what's happening than the data that we have. Fantastic. Over to Austin Wyatt, for whom, for identification purposes, RAND Australia is the corporation he's currently working at. Austin, would you like to unmute and share your reflections?
Yes, thanks, Katina. Thank you very much, Kathleen. I think, as I said before we got started, one of the problems with this paper is that every time I thought, oh, that's something I can follow up on, it was in the next paragraph. So yeah, overall, really interesting. My background's in looking at some of the socio-technical stuff around autonomous weapons. So I thought it was really interesting that you quite justifiably made that socio-technical analysis a real focus. And I think part of what often gets lost in these sorts of discussions, especially when you talk to the engineers, is that it is that socio-technical factor. None of these technologies are value neutral, and actually having to justify and build trust with the people that we're actually going to ask to use them is a vital component in getting them used and making sure that there's limited negative consequences. And I think that's particularly important in militaries, but also in the intelligence community. Not to worry, my pet won't jump up on the screen because it's a greyhound and she's currently down there. But if she gets up on the screen, it'll probably crush the table. Moving on. So yeah, I think the ethical and organizational factors are often overlooked in innovation. So it was really interesting to see them here. And I think, you know, part of the interesting challenge with this is the heterogeneous nature of the intelligence community in the US. So in Australia, we have an internal and an external focused intelligence agency. And there are obviously territorial disputes within and between those organizations. But we don't have the same sort of level of the number of actors in the pond. So it's interesting looking at it from that perspective. In a way, it's more complex than would be in an Australian context. I think part of the challenge with some of these technologies will be how do we incentivize their use? Because there is always going to be a risk. if you're an intelligence analyst, your bread and butter is the information you put forward and the analysis you put forward. If you're delegating a level of that to a machine, there's a risk you have to accept, and there's an incentive that we have to put in there, whether that's managerial or whether that's time saved and efficiency. I think depends on the system and depends on the organization. I think my new favorite quote of the week is that one of the things I've seen is that metadata lies. I think it's, that is in the context of managerial decisions in this paper, but I think it's a lot broader than that, especially when you look at intelligence analysis, this idea of, there is a risk of privileging certain quantitative data over qualitative data, over those gaps that Theresa was talking about. And, there is also that risk there. That's really well known. If you're a qualitative researcher, everyone's been in a conference where you said, here is my qualitative research, and I had 6 interviewees. And it's like, well, I had 50. It's like, well, so there is that, that's well familiar. I just wish we had a solution. I think there is that risk of standardizing analysis from that over emphasis and overweighting on certain qualitative data. I think that's particularly important when we look at systems like the prototype or like systems where they're designed to interpret and prioritize masses of incoming quantitative data for our analysts. I spent a little bit of time at Defence Science and Technology Group here in Australia, and one of the things that they were working on was a system for futures analysis that would essentially trawl the internet and look at news articles and papers and things and highlight. And that was something that the data scientists were working on solving even in that respect. Now, how do we prioritize not just looking at a Wyatt or looking at technologies that we know the keywords for? And that I think would be bigger in the intelligence community. I think overall, the main contribution of this paper, from at least my perspective, is this application of socio-technical factors to AI. I think AI and intelligence community have this interesting correlation here, in that both are deeply invested in knowledge creation, and there is an inherent black box effect in both types of thing, in an AI and in an intelligence community, that both have to really work towards explaining their logic among restraints, whether those classification or methodological constraints, to a non-expert audience. And I think they can really learn from each other. They're the data scientists and the intelligence community. So yeah, that's what I had conscious about going over time. I think one of the interesting follow-ups would be, I know you said you're interested in looking at other states. I think it'd be interesting to look at what happens if you try to put these systems in a state that doesn't have the same strong norms around what's an appropriate and ethical use of intelligence resources. I'm thinking not just about, a China or a Russia, but also the more liberal states, or the states that, have a track record of using national security resources for domestic law enforcement. Indonesia is a classic example. So that's, I think, would be really interesting, looking at that and looking at how, whether it's training or whether it's norms, whether it has to happen at the design stage. We're only designing systems that don't allow for use in these systems, I think would be really fascinating. Yes, that's me. I really recommend reading the paper. If you haven't read the paper, go read it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Austin. Kathleen, any things that you navigate to in particular in that commentary?
Well, I just loved your comment on the last comment about different applications, in terms of looking at other countries that might have different norms, or how they might use intelligence, or the internal dynamics there that might shape the design and development adoption, I think would be fascinating. So I would love to see someone doing that kind of work.
Awesome. We're moving on now to Mariana Zafeirakopoulos, who's a PhD candidate, among many other things, teaching and doing wonderful instruction at the University of Technology, Sydney, among other places. Welcome, Mariana.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. And Kathleen, congratulations on a great paper. Theresa and Austin, I just wanted to start off by echoing the comments that you've already addressed. You've stolen some of my points, but rather than using that language, I'll say that I'll build upon them. starting off with this theme around qualitative research, what came to me, and only because I've been reading about it a lot more recently as part of my own PhD research, but this idea of information power. The more information the sample holds, the lower amount of participants needed. But that doesn't necessarily seem to ring true for you, Kathleen. And in your research, you had a richness of participants and depth of knowledge that came out. And that really showed in the kind of insights that you shared as part of your discussion. And there was a lot that I found really intriguing and really interesting, and that certainly some that rang quite true in terms of my own experiences working in the intelligence profession, but also working on the other side, trying to think about how we provide support to intelligence analysts. So it was really interesting to see that come through. Like Theresa and Austin, I have a lot of thoughts. Some, unlike Theresa and Austin, they may not be as connected and coherent, but I'll start and we'll see where we go. One thing that really came through from what I heard in your research, Kathleen, was this theme of trust. What it kind of spoke to, and what came out of that for me was trust as an overarching theme. Specifically, when you were talking to this point around intelligence analysts caring about technology, something that came from your research, what that reminded me of, certainly, again, just connecting back to my own experiences in the field, analysts want technology to make their lives easier, but that's in direct contrast sometimes, and it's a tension with being accountable for what you put out there. And it might be different in our jurisdiction here in Australia, but increasingly we're seeing intelligence analysts attend to court to be called upon to explain how they came up with a judgment, with an assessment. And that's really difficult to do when you're drawing from, you're using your judgment, your best judgment based on the information that you don't have your ability to interrogate biases, but at the same time, these qualitative spaces make it challenging because you can't necessarily point to it in quantitative ways, which can seem compelling, but can still be contrived. You know, we all know quantitative data can come across as quite convincing, but can be tweaked and massaged depending on the message you want to give. So it's a really challenging job. What came through to me, connecting it to this idea of trust, and I guess the thoughts that I wanted to share sort of all revolve around this theme. But often as intelligence practitioners, we're called upon, and if I may, sort of drawing from complex adaptive systems leadership language, you know, where we're called upon to raise the heat, to challenge the status quo, to try and push the system to think differently and not be not being drawn into confirmation bias or what the mass sort of view is. But at the same time, if you're not in a space where it's safe to do that, you're not going to have analysts that are going to be taking risks. And so the uptake of technology, and Austin, I think on this point, I hold a different view on this. I think you're right when you say that it's about incentivizing the use of technology. My thoughts around that is, for that to be successful, you need to create a safe environment. The organization needs to create a safe space for analysts to do that, because you can incentivize the analysts as much as you'd like for them to adopt the tech and to experiment and have a go, to raise the heat. But at the end of the day, if the risk of getting something wrong is quite high and the consequence of that is quite high, analysts are less likely to, despite their best intentions, despite the desire to go along with organizational strategy and promotion of this way of thinking and working, they're unlikely to throw their whole selves into it, because it's too risky for them. Not just, as I mentioned, being called to account in these legal settings, but professionally in terms of promotion, potentially. The other thought that I just wanted to share, connected to this idea of knowledge and how we step into these really challenging spaces, I thought it was really intriguing. And again, just thinking about AI and as a black box, not necessarily being able to point to how information comes together is one aspect. But this idea of expertise, and so often an intelligence analyst is looked to as an expert. And in some contexts, we might be. So there are certainly, at least in the Australian context, you can have intelligence analysts that are experts in a field. But in other contexts, as I have in my past, one day you might be focusing on environmental crime, the next day you're focusing on cybercrime, not literally the next day, but the topics are often quite shifting and evolving. And so you're seen as an expert by the community, potentially the client of the intelligence product, but you're also learning. And so it's really interesting to think about the role that the technology can have in supporting an analyst to grapple and move across these different disciplines as they're learning. And so on the one hand, I can see a real utility, a real use for tech as an enabler of knowledge, the things that we can know in the current state. But I'm really interested, and perhaps it's a question back to you, Kathleen, around exploration. So we've talked a lot about the role of intelligence analysis in generating knowledge, but what about the role of technology in helping us to explore spaces that are not yet known, that more exploratory space? And I was curious to ask you, Kathleen, whether in your research, I know it was very much situated within helping to make intelligence practitioners' lives a little easier and grounded within how do we generate knowledge and how to contribute knowledge to the field based on judgment. But did you come across anything in your discussions with analysts about more of that exploration? So things that we don't know, but things seem to be emergent and more around that uncertainty, and whether there's a role for this kind of technology in helping us to think about different futures, what might be ahead, that can help push our brains beyond what we already know and already think, because as we all know, we're quite limited in terms of our creativity and what we think might be happening. So it's a bit of a double-barreled question there, but I just wanted to welcome any insights or thoughts that you may have found as a result of your research. But maybe I'll pause there for now.
Thank you so much, Mariana. That's great comments and great set of questions. Just a few things that just popped to mind. So this lab where the work was done, the Laboratory for Analytic Sciences at North Carolina State University, they are very much into the exploratory with these technologies. And their original mission, at least when I was there, I think it's changed a little bit since I've been there, but when I was there back in 2014, when they were really first around that time they were kind of created, it was really about thinking about the future of intelligence analysts 20, 30 years plus out, and really trying to think now about technology design, imagining what that analytic workspace is going to look like, or what they're going to need, or how technologies could be created for that future environment. So it was very much not seen, at least initially, when some of these prototypes were being developed, and not just the one that I was talking about, but they have several others, and I can put the link if you're interested in the chat. But I was really trying to think about a whole suite of new technologies that could start to be designed now, with the understanding that it's going to take years to sort of actually implement them, but we need to be prepared for exploring kind of how do we use technologies to explore the threat space and do better analysis and things along those lines. I will say, as what happens with a lot of intelligence entities, I think the pressure to be relevant today is something that institution, there's been more pressure for them to show how these technologies can be applied now. Which is interesting to think about how the original sort of mandate or vision was to be more future thinking, but now it's been asked to think more presently. But just one other brief comment on this whole issue that you raised about trust, and analysts need to know that if they experiment with these things, there's not going to be adverse career implications. If they do, I think is a really important one. I think one other issue that has come up sort of since, as these technologies now are sort of being imagined within the intelligence community, you start seeing some discussions about what will they mean for like the identity of the analyst, if things are moving to be more automated, if things that we thought that analysts through their own subject matter training could only do, but now they're being, turned over to machines, then what is the role of the analyst? What will that look like? What will be the type of analyst? Do you need subject matter experts? Or do you need someone that's just going to curate the data? So there are these kind of interesting things that are starting to populate now about like the workforce and who might be an analyst, what their job roles might be, what is the proper composition of different kinds of, backgrounds or training of analysts that I think these technologies are also now starting to trigger as well. So with that, I'll have the other panelists comment.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you as well, Mariana, for that rich commentary and question. To our final guest panelist is Jack Goldsmith, who's currently completing studies at the Australian National University and also working for identification purposes at CyberCX.
Thank you, Katina. Thank you, Kathleen. That was a great presentation, and I very much enjoyed the article. I suppose the main takeaway that that I took from the presentation and from the article was the way that machine learning tools can formalize what would otherwise be kind of fluid epistemic processes that are kind of ill-defined, or kind of, you know, everyone, there's a sensory kind of feeling about them, rather than you know, the codification and the quantification of them. I think that's enormously important for understanding the relationship between analysts and machines. And I think this work has really kind of fleshed that out. One thing that I think I'll just kind of piggyback off something that Mariana brought up of the exploratory space for this. I've previously done some research in a similar vein on the role of machine learning tools in the national security community, not my current role, but in a previous position. And one philosophy I found quite helpful in this respect was that of meaningful inefficiencies by Eric Gordon and Stephen Walter. This approach of deliberately kind of investing in spontaneous kind of creative thought to offset the kind of rigid formulaic processes that arise from machine learning technologies. So that's I mean, I can link the article to whoever's interested, but I found that as really kind of stark kind of contrast to the overwhelming kind of programmatic way in which a lot of knowledge is gathered in the intelligence community, but indeed in the business community more broadly. I've got a handful of questions here. I'll try and prioritize them. I'm interested to see if this was gleaned from the interviews at all, what your interviewees thought of a sweet spot between efficiency and explainability. I mean, it's my understanding that black box algorithms are the most efficient, but hard to kind of decipher and back engineer, whereas, you know, glass box models, opposite is the case. It's easy to see how it's going on, but it's comparably not as efficient. And it kind of, from a broader perspective, it's kind of interesting to consider that versus how our adversaries are using these technologies, right? I think it's my understanding that some of our adversaries in our region, in the Indo-Pacific region, have kind of bitten wholesale into machine learning technologies and using AI for solving their intelligence problems, solving their kind of meta crisis problems. But whereas I think in the Western sphere, at least, I think that we've cherished the kind of values of accountability and transparency far more. They kind of percolate to the top, I think, far more. So I'm interested to see if there were any kind of, if that at all resonated with your interviewees, of efficiency and explainability, and understanding that they are somewhat opposed, and where they'll be willing to perhaps compromise on one or the other. Another thing that interested me greatly was the, again, linking back to that kind of epistemic angle, was of how much info is provided to the intelligence analyst, as in how much is presented to them that they can digest and consume and turn into useful intelligence. I know that some of our, the Australian Defence Force, sorry, not the Defence Force, but some of our Defence Department has looked at this issue of how much information is being presented to, you know, an analyst, and what they can usefully do with it. So that's another angle I found interesting. Another angle I thought of is that historically, the intelligence community, this goes back to another previous comment made, it has acted as its own black box. You know, in the US, in Australia, across the world, intelligence communities like to silo themselves off, even from, you know, other spheres of government. And I'm wondering, in the kind of in the age we're in, where's the role for the private sector and for other stakeholders to participate in this intelligence process? Now, you can see how the resistance by the intelligence community would be immediate and apparent. But I think that given the state we're in, given the kind of the conditions at play, I think perhaps there's room for in the intelligence community to really kind of consider not alternative, but kind of partners that hereto they kind of had a kind of distance relationship from, particularly in deciphering, you know, some of this. Again, if you're being presented with a whole heap of information, I think the metadata lies comment, right? You need someone. I would argue you would need a human foremostly to kind of really digest through that, depending on the amount of information presented. But so those were my main questions. I suppose a few other comments that I took away. You know, what is this, the mass procurement of machine learning and algorithms in the intelligence community? How does that influence procurement? Principally, how do we ensure that we are the sovereign, or our intelligence communities are the sovereign entity in procurement, and they're not reliant on an external partner far more so than they would be in traditional procurement in, you know, say the defense sector. And I suppose this shows my kind of normative banner, but I was wondering if there were any kind of comments that directly indicated a kind of a distrust of big data as an a priori method for understanding truth in the world and making sense of intelligence, because that's certainly a skeptical viewpoint that I reserve. But no, it was a fantastic article, a great presentation, and yeah, I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on those.
Thank you so much, Jack. A lot of, great questions, and lots of things that I could sort of try and give a response. So one issue that you talked about is whether the analysts that I interviewed might be okay with like a glass box or something that, you know, maybe they wouldn't know full details, but they would know enough to know that they could move forward. And I think, from my recollection, I think they would be open to, you know, having something that wasn't, you know, full blown. They would have to know all of the inner workings, but something where, again, that they could sort of at least have some sense of the kind of output. I think the one thing that came up in some of the interviews, though, was just one sticking point would be, let's say an intelligence failure happens again, and then you do the audit trails to try and figure out where the error was introduced, and it's encoded into these systems. And there is maybe an analyst that's sort of working with some of these systems. Like, there's a lot of discomfort with what happens in that scenario, and who is it, if there's going to be blame placed. And so I think that on a practical kind of working level, I think there would be, my sense is they would be, at least the ones that I interviewed, would be okay with, like, there, you know, some transparency, but maybe not full. But then again, some concerns about, it's basically when things go wrong. And again, it's the error, the blame, or the error, like what's going to happen when something bad happens. So that's just kind of one thing that occurs to me from your question. The second point about kind of the information kind of overload, or the information silos, that is a real kind of issue and a concern. And in part, that's why some of these big data sort of technologies were developed, is trying to help analysts kind of more efficiently sort through a lot of these reams of, you know, both classified and unclassified data that's coming in. But sort of these silos also exist. They've existed within the intelligence community because different kinds of technologies have been procured over time for different kind of upper level management reasons. And these sort of information systems that have been acquired don't necessarily talk to each other. So there's not only the information overload, but let's say you have a lot of information overload, but then those systems are not connected. So then there's a lot of burden on the analysts. Sometimes they have to write, I was talking to one analyst who said they have to write code to actually extract like data from different systems. And when you think about like then having to do that on top of like other things in your day, just this whole thing of how you interact and manage these systems that are being introduced, I think there's a lot of questions about how those things come together at the working level, you know. So just again, just a lot of questions that it raises about, you know, as all of these new systems are getting introduced, like how are they going to talk to each other? How are they going to be managed? You know. Let's see, the other issue that raised is about sort of the private sector and the role of the private sector, and that also gets to procurement kind of issues too, particularly with these kind of data science technologies, because a lot of them are the fundamental technologies and expertise is based on in the open world. It's not necessarily in the classified world. And this is, again, this has kind of triggered this issue of like the private sector involvement with big data. And I've seen it more come up, although I'm sure it comes up on the classified side too. I've seen it much more come up with different current debates about the role of open source intelligence and whether and these have been ongoing debates. The intelligence community needs to do more with open source. And there's been a lot of different discussions about, well, now with these new, essentially private sector, a lot of expertise on the outside, a lot of private sector tools that are available to do kind of open source intelligence. Shouldn't the intelligence community be focused more on that? And that's raised other questions of, should we start outsourcing that kind of work? So the analyst, for example, is no longer responsible for that. It gets outsourced to some private entity. But then a lot of questions come up again about, then the intelligence community is going to be reliant on these private entities and what other issues can come up with too much reliance. And this gets into now an internal debate that's happening about, should the intelligence community now be training and bringing in more data scientists to have that internal capacity to do this work rather than outsourcing it? Or some would say, we're not going to be able to fundamentally transform the workforce with data scientists, so you're going to have to rely on the outside. Why don't we just outsource it? It's more efficient. So you start seeing again these debates that are happening now about what to do about the private sector, and I have a feeling that's going to continue. I don't think that's going away, and it is an interesting workforce problem of, do you more invest internally to bring this kind of expertise in, or do you kind of rely more on outsourcing? On the distrust of big data, I would say there was definitely, you know, although these practitioners, I would say were very technology lovers or technology friendly, they were also very seasoned analysts who had sort of, and practitioners who also saw the pitfalls of relying too much on sort of data, you know, being somewhat skeptical of some kinds of technologies. So I felt that they had a very healthy awareness of sort of relying on technologies alone, although they were excited about sort of new technological, you know, possibilities and all of that. So, you know, I found that interesting, especially when you counter it with like a lot of the outside, the media rhetoric, which is like, oh, the intelligence community is all about big data. And it's like, yes, but then internally you see there are different mixed opinions about, again, trusting, I think as Mariana sort of talks about trusting these kinds of technologies, how to make sense with these technologies. The people who are actually using them on a day-to-day or having to grapple with that, they're very aware of some of these, you know, bigger problems that can come up with these technologies.
What an astute set of questions and answers there. Thank you, Jack, and thank you, Kathleen. We've got reflections and questions and comments in the chat. We won't have time for them all, but I just want to put them on record here for those listening. Dr. Abbas says, thank you, Kathleen, for your excellent presentation, and to our panel for the brilliant reflections. Questions related for Kathleen in a future time. You mentioned the need for socio-technical interventions. What shape or form do you see these interventions taking? Where do you suggest we start building on the outcomes of your work? And how do we design and implement these interventions from a practical perspective? And that for a future conversation, perhaps offline. But we do want to say a big thank you to all our audience for gracing us with their presence. Thank you so much for our keynote speaker, Professor Kathleen Vogel, for preparing and presenting her research on behalf of her team, her list of co-authors that were mentioned. You've been illuminating in the background, Kathleen, on and off. I know it's Arizona weather, but there is something illuminating about you. And to our expert panelists, Theresa Anderson, Austin Wyatt, Mariana Zafeirakopoulos, and Jack Goldsmith, thank you for your volunteerism today, your expertise and your backgrounds, and those incredible comments and questions. Thank you also to your respective organizations for giving you this opportunity to share in this colloquium. Please pass that on. And PIT does bring diverse communities together. I mean, Kathleen, a PhD in biophysical chemistry and socio-technical systems, and this amazing work in national security. That is transdisciplinarity at its heart. If you'd like to listen to any part of today's recording or share it with a colleague, please do so. Our programs are archived on both IEEE.tv and the SFIS YouTube channel Public Interest Technology Colloquium playlist. We look forward to your company again next week. Until then, we wish you the very best week ahead. Thank you again to everyone.